The United States has had its eyes on Cuba for a very long time. Even before Castro came along, the U.S. wanted control of this island. Let us take a look at how we got here with the entire history of USAV's Cuba in under 6 minutes. This is part 5 of our America's Secret History series, where we cover topics that most Americans do unlearn about in school. We're redoing the whole series again because we missed a few episodes last year due to some technical difficulties. But now we're back on track with more episodes coming soon. Be sure to check out the other videos in this series. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any more episodes. You can also watch this entire series on our website. Alright, let's get started. In the early 1800s, Cuba was still a Spanish colony. They had been trying to win their independence from Spain since 1823 when the first insurrection against Spain began. The U.S., however, didn't want an independent Cuba. You see, Cuba controlled the western entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. And the U.S. was worried about European powers controlling this strategic location. In 1823, President James Monroe made his famous Monroe Doctrine. Part of the doctrine stated that the Americas were not to be considered as a proper subject for any future colonization by any European powers. Not only did this discourage colonization, but it also implied that the U.S. would intervene in any attempt by a European power to expand their influence in the Americas. It's this doctrine that prevents Italy from taking over Las Vegas today. But that's a story for another day. The point is, the U.S. was very concerned about keeping European powers out of the Americas. And they saw Cuba as a potential threat to this goal. If Cuba gained independence from Spain, there was no guarantee that they would remain friendly towards the U.S., in fact. It was much more likely that an independent Cuba would become aligned with Britain and France, who had significant commercial interests on the island. To avoid this, the U.S. wanted to purchase Cuba from Spain. In 1848, President Polk offered Spain $100 million for Cuba, which is around $3 billion in today's money. Spain refused. The U.S. had never been one to take no for an answer. So in 1854, 3 U.S. diplomats met in Ostend, Belgium, to write a manifesto outlining their plan to take Cuba from Spain. This document outlined several reasons why the U.S. should annex Cuba, including strategic concerns, economic interests, and humanitarian reasons. However, it also included a veiled threat that if Spain refused to sell the island, the U.S. would just take it. Here's what it said, quote, "The only alternative which presents itself to the acquisition of the island by the United States is its acquisition by some European power. The nearer such a catastrophe approaches, the clearer it will become that the true interests of the two nations are identified in the fullest, in most complete manner." That was basically code for, if you don't sell us this island, we're gonna take it. The Ostend Manifesto was a major embarrassment for the U.S. when it was leaked to the press. Many Americans, including President Pierce, who had pushed for the document, tried to distance themselves from it. Eventually, Pierce disavowed the manifesto, claiming that it didn't accurately represent his views. However, he went on to order the U.S. Navy to blockade Cuban ports and stop trade with Spain. He also sent an envoy to demand that Spain either accept the purchase offer or agree to end slavery on the island. When Spain refused, Pierce responded by sending in the Marines. Now, the plan to invade Cuba wasn't all that complicated. American ships would sail into Havana and seize control of the city. From there, they would establish a provisional government and wait for the U.S. to either annex the island or leave. Of course. This plan didn't account for the Cuban people who were too happy about the prospect of being annexed by the U.S. There were many Cubans who supported independence from both Spain and the U.S., and they were willing to fight for their freedom. In 1850, a group of Cuban rebels led by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes launched an insurrection against both Spain and the U.S. The rebels fought bravely, but they were ultimately defeated. However, this uprising showed the U.S. that they couldn't simply walk into Cuba and take what they wanted. it would be a costly and bloody affair. And with the Mexican-American War still fresh in their minds, Americans weren't eager to start another conflict. Still, the desire to control Cuba remained. Southerners, in particular, wanted the island because it would bring in new territory that allowed for the expansion of slavery. For decades, the debate over Cuba raged on in Congress, but ultimately, the U.S. decided that it wasn't worth the cost. Instead, they focused their attention on other areas of the Western Hemisphere, like the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. These islands were much easier to acquire and control. And they didn't have the same strategic value as Cuba. But that doesn't mean that the U.S. was done with the island. Oh no. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out. The U.S. went to war with Spain in large part to gain control of Cuba. And despite fierce fighting, the U.S. was victorious. Spain was forced to grant Cuba independence, but not before making them a protectorate of the U.S. This meant that the U.S. could intervene in Cuban affairs whenever they saw fit, and they wasted no time doing so. Soon after the war, the U.S. sent troops to restore order and protect American business interests. They also forced Cuba to accept a Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. even more control over the island. For the next 20 years, Cuba was effectively a puppet state of the U.S. They couldn't make any decisions without the approval of the American government, and they couldn't even have an army of their own. This situation only began to change during the Cuban Revolution of 1953, led by Fidel Castro. The Cubans fought to overthrow the government and end U.S. influence on the island. After years of fighting, Castro's forces were victorious. He became the leader of Cuba and immediately began to undo the damage done by the U.S. He nationalized industries, reformed the economy, and ended U.S. control of the island. For the U.S., this was a major blow. They had lost their most valuable possession in the Western Hemisphere, and there was nothing they could do about it. All attempts to overthrow Castro failed, and the U.S. was left with egg on their face. Today, the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba remains tense. Despite the efforts of each government to normalize relations, there is still a lot of distrust between the two countries. The legacy of the past continues to cast a shadow over their present. This is USA versus Cuba, a true story. Part 1. The Early Years. We go way back to 1492, when Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer sailing for Spain, landed in Cuba. He thought he was in India, so he called the natives Indians. He also claimed Cuba for Spain. Spain ruled Cuba for the next 4 centuries. They grew sugarcane there, which they had brought from India. They used African slaves to work the fields. Some escaped slaves set up their own communities. In 1866, most Cubans were still working on sugar plantations. Only about 10% of the population could read or write. In the early 1800s, Latin American countries began revolting against their European rulers. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and others wanted freedom. Cuba tried, too. From 1866 to 1878, there was a war between Cuba and Spain. The result? 100,000 dead Cubans, a lot of them civilians. Spain had won, but now they had to deal with a new leader. This guy, Máximo Gómez, born in 1819, became the main general of the Cuban army. He led the revolution for 10 years, until finally, in 1898, the Cubans won their independence. Or did they? Not exactly. Let's rewind to 1895, when Cuban rebels started fighting Spain again. This time, they wanted full independence from Spain, not just more freedom within the Spanish Empire. The United States didn't like Spanish rule in Cuba. President Grover Cleveland even said, quote, "The continued oppression of the Cubans by the Spanish government has been a reproach to the Menshite and a scandal to the Christian religion." So the U.S. gave the Cuban rebels some support. However, both Britain and France thought this was a bad idea. There was already a lot of tension in Europe. Those old colonial rivalries between Britain and Spain were being played out on a much bigger stage. World War II. No one wanted another war in America. But then came 1898. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. This was a U.S. ship that had gone to Cuba to protect Americans living there. The ship blew up, and 266 American sailors died. The yellow press in the U.S. immediately blamed Spain and demanded war. The New York Journal said, quote, "The Maine was done up in a Spanish match factory." The headline of the New York World said, quote, "A Spanish cigarette." Okay, no one really knows what caused the explosion, but that doesn't matter. The public wanted war. President McKinley didn't want war, but he didn't have a choice. Congress declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898. That summer, the U.S. sent troops to Cuba. They took over Havana and set up camp outside the city. That camp would become infamous for disease and death. It was called Camp Wyckoff. Here's what it looked like. Here's what it smelled like. Yellow fever and malaria spread through the camp. 1,500 U.S. soldiers died there. Meanwhile, on the front lines, things weren't going much better. The U.S. hadn't prepared well for war. Their army was small and outdated. The Navy was strong, though, and easily defeated the Spanish Navy. On July 3, 1898, the Spanish surrendered Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States. This was the Spanish-American War. It lasted only 3 months and resulted in 5,000 dead Americans and 1,000 dead Cubans. Then what happened to Cuba? Well, in 1902, they got their independence. Or did they? Not exactly. See, before leaving Cuba, the U.S. forced Cuba to sign something called the Platt Amendment. The amendment said that if Cuba wanted to make a treaty with another country or go into debt, they had to get permission from the United States. Essentially, the U.S. still controlled Cuba. They also kept control of Guantanamo Bay on the southeastern part of the island. And here's why. Back in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt built a canal through Panama. But in case someone tried to block the canal, he wanted a base in Cuba. Plus, the people of Guantanamo Bay were mostly black. At the time, the U.S. didn't want to let black people vote or have rights. So they just took over their land and turned it into a military base. So yeah, in 1902, Cuba got its independence from Spain. But they still had to deal with the United States. For the next 20 years, the U.S. meddled in Cuban affairs. They pressured the president to resign. They took over the country twice. Oh, and in 1912, they helped overthrow the Cuban Constitution. Then, in 1917, the U.S. intervened again. They said that German agents were trying to buy arms in Cuba, so U.S. troops took over again. And now we get to prohibition. You see, the United States stopped making and selling alcohol in 1920. But guess where people could buy alcohol? Cuba. During the 1920s and 30s, tons of Americans went to Cuba for vacations and drinking. But then came 1952. A guy named Batista overthrew the government in a military coup. The U.S. wasn't happy about this. President Truman said he didn't like coups, and of course, he didn't like that Batista was a dictator. But most of all, he didn't like that Batista might shut down American businesses in Cuba. So in 1954, the CIA helped overthrow Batista. It was called Operation PBS. U.S. officials called it a, quote, covert operation. What they really did was fund and train a rebel group and then watch as they overthrew Batista. Oh, and also, they cut off Batista's supply of toilet paper. Yeah, that was a real thing. According to a U.S. official, the plan was to make life, quote, as miserable as possible. Mission accomplished because Batista fled to Spain. But who took over after him? Well, this guy, Fidel Castro. Now, Castro was a revolutionary. He had fought against Batista for years. He wanted land reform, health care for all, free education, and the nationalization of banks and industries. These were very popular ideas. Castro had huge support, and yet the United States wasn't happy. First of all, they didn't like communists. And second, they liked doing business with Batista. The dictator was great for the American businesses. He relaxed environmental rules so they could pollute. He made them pay low wages. He took little or no taxes. The workers had no rights. But now Castro was in charge, and he was promising to change everything. Of course, the United States didn't like that. They liked their businesses to be able to pollute and pay low wages and not pay taxes and ignore workers. Anyway, the U.S. tried to get rid of Castro. They put economic sanctions on Cuba. They also tried to assassinate him. Over the years, they tried 637 times. Some of the attempts were comical, like putting a mafia hitman dressed as a woman on a movie set. Other attempts were more dangerous. One time, a U.S. plane dropped a deadly poison on Castro's shoes. Another time, they tried to blow up a hotel where he was staying. And now, we get to the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was the United States' biggest attempt to get rid of Castro. In 1961, the CIA trained 1,500 Cuban exiles and then sent them to Cuba. Their mission? To invade the country and overthrow Castro. It was a disaster. The Cuban army defeated them in 2 days. And ever since then, the U.S. hasn't tried to overthrow Castro or any other Cuban leader. And don't think that's because they gave up. Just look at this map. This is how many countries the U.S. has overthrown since 1945. Oh, and by the way, in 1959, Castro visited the Soviet Union and met with Nikita Khrushchev. This was important because now the Soviets would help Cuba and vice versa. In 1962, the U.S. put more sanctions on Cuba. They also cut off all trade. In response, Cuba strengthened ties with the Soviets. Then in October 1962, the world almost ended. The Soviets were installing missiles in Cuba. If the U.S. detected them, it would be a big problem. For 13 days, the world worried about nuclear war. Finally, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for not invading Cuba. Okay, fast forward to today. The U.S. still has a military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Technically, they lease the land from Cuba, but they haven't paid rent in over 100 years. And technically, the U.S. and Cuba are still at war. Why? Because neither country has ended the state of war. If you were to ask a Cuban citizen if they were at war with the United States, they would say no. Same with the U.S. citizens. Most people have no idea that the war never ended. Now, in the last few years, the U.S. and Cuba have taken steps toward normalizing relations. In 2014, Obama and Raul Castro started talking. In 2015, they reopened embassies in each other's countries. In 2016, Obama visited Cuba, becoming the first sitting president to visit Cuba in almost 90 years. Today, many Cuban professionals leave Cuba for Miami. They're called Cuban exiles. Many of them come for political reasons, but most come for economic reasons. In 2018, the average salary in Cuba was $29. In 2018, the average salary in Miami was $54. And now we turn to Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro's Communist Revolution 1956-1959 had just come to power in Cuba, and all of this had been made possible by the support of thousands of ordinary Cubans who wanted a better future for themselves and their country. The revolution had been led by Castro and his close friend Che Guevara, and they had fought against the brutal dictator Batista, whom they finally overthrew. The revolution was seen as a victory not only for the Cuban people, but also for the communist cause. This was a time when many countries around the world were still stuck in the colonial era, and the U.S. was worried that if it didn't do something to prevent the spread of communism, then it could become contagious and other nations would follow suit. So the U.S. decided to take action. They imposed sanctions on Cuba in an effort to punish them for what they had done, and also to try and force them to change their ways. But this backfired massively, as it turned out that ordinary Cubans were too happy about how things were going in their country. As a result, relations between Cuba and the U.S. became increasingly strained, and eventually, in 1961, the U.S. completely cut off all diplomatic ties with Cuba. This had a devastating effect on the Cuban economy, because now they no longer had access to American markets or the investments that they needed to grow. But Castro and his government were undeterred, and they decided to forge ahead with communism anyway. Over the next few years, Castro's government began to seize U.S.-owned land and factories and other industries and nationalize them so that they would be run by the state. This included some of the largest and most profitable companies in Cuba, such as sugar mills, tobacco fields, and even banks. By doing this, Castro was able to solidify his power base and create a more equitable society for all Cubans. However, this move did not go down well with the United States, who felt that Castro was taking their property without just compensation. In fact, the U.S. had already been imposing economic sanctions on Cuba since 1958 in response to Castro's takeover of American-owned businesses. But now that he had taken such drastic measures, the U.S. felt compelled to do something about it. On February 3, 1960, President Eisenhower signed an executive order prohibiting all imports from Cuba. And shortly after that, he also placed an embargo on all exports to Cuba as well. Then, in 1961, the U.S. broke off all diplomatic relations with the island nation, and this marked a significant turning point in the history of both countries. Castro saw the US's actions as nothing more than an attempt to contain the spread of communism, and he was determined not to let it happen on his watch. He had already received support from the Soviet Union, and he knew that he could count on their military and economic aid if needed. Meanwhile, the U.S. was also preparing for a potential conflict with the Soviets as well as with Cuba. They built up their military presence in the region and began to develop plans for a possible invasion of the island. However, neither side ever took any overt military action against each other. Instead, they engaged in a series of proxy wars throughout Latin America and Africa, where each side supported different factions in order to weaken the other. This period of hostility between the two countries lasted for nearly 3 decades until the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe during the late 1980s. Only then did the U.S. and Cuba begin to normalize relations once again. So what can we learn from this story? Well, first of all, we can see how important it is for countries to have good diplomatic relations with one another, because even if there are disagreements, having open lines of communication can help prevent things from escalating into larger conflicts. Secondly, we can also see how sanctions can sometimes do more harm than good. In this case, they only serve to strengthen Castro's position and power and make him even more popular among the Cuban people. Finally, we can learn that even during the height of the Cold War, it was still possible for countries to find common ground and eventually normalize relations. Now, if you want to learn more about the Cold War, check out my video on the Cuban Missile Crisis here. Until the early 1990s, Cuba was heavily reliant on the Soviet Union for economic assistance. However, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed soon after, Cuba lost its biggest trading partner and source of foreign investment. This sudden economic shock led to widespread shortages of basic goods and services in Cuba, which in turn caused a lot of suffering for ordinary Cubans. In addition, the collapse of communism also led to political instability in Cuba, which resulted in protests and calls for democracy from the Cuban people. However, Castro's government responded with a violent crackdown, and those who called for democracy were either imprisoned or exiled from the country. Despite these challenges, though, Cuba has managed to survive economically and politically in the years since the Cold War ended. This is largely due to the fact that Castro's government has been able to maintain tight control over the country and suppress any opposition to their rule. Additionally, the Cuban government has also been able to diversify its economy away from its reliance on the Soviet Union by opening up to tourism and foreign investment in recent years. Nevertheless, despite these efforts, Cuba continues to face serious economic and political problems today. The country's infrastructure is outdated and decaying, its economy is stagnant, and its citizens still suffer from widespread poverty and inequality. Furthermore, the Cuban government's heavy-handed approach to suppressing dissent has also drawn criticism from the international community. As a result, many are calling for Castro to step down and for Cuba to transition to a more democratic system of government. However, it remains to be seen whether or not this will happen anytime soon. Castro is still very popular among the Cuban people, and he has shown no signs of slowing down. In fact, he recently celebrated his 90th birthday, and he continues to play an active role in the country's politics. Overall, the end of the Cold War had a profound impact on Cuba. It lost its biggest trading partner and ally, which caused serious economic and political problems. However, the Cuban government has been able to keep itself in power by maintaining tight control over the country and diversifying its economy. Despite this, the country still faces serious challenges today, and many are calling for change. Only time will tell what the future holds for Cuba. What are your thoughts on the end of the Cold War and its impact on Cuba? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out my others for more historical tales like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. The U.S. government has long been concerned about the spread of communism, and they felt threatened by the growing influence of the Soviet Union in Cuba. When Castro came to power, the U.S. believed that he was a communist sympathizer, and they feared that he would align himself with the Soviet Union. This fear was confirmed when Castro began to nationalize American-owned businesses in Cuba and align himself with the communist bloc. The U.S. felt that this was a direct threat to its national security, and they decided to take action. They imposed economic sanctions on Cuba and broke off diplomatic relations in an effort to isolate the country and prevent it from becoming a Soviet ally. The end of the Cold War brought about a new set of challenges for Cuba. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its biggest trading partner and source of foreign aid. This led to a sharp decline in the Cuban economy, which in turn caused food and medical supply shortages. In addition, Cuba also lost the protection that the Soviet Union had provided during the Cold War. This left the country vulnerable to potential threats from the U.S. and other countries. Despite these challenges, the Cuban government has been able to maintain control over the country by cracking down on dissent and suppressing any opposition to their rule. Additionally, the Cuban government has also been able to diversify its economy by opening up to tourism and foreign investment in recent years. Today, Cuba continues to face serious economic and political problems. Its infrastructure is outdated and decaying, its economy is stagnant, and its citizens still suffer from widespread poverty and inequality. However, despite these challenges, the Cuban government remains in power and shows no signs of slowing down. Castro is still very popular among the Cuban people, and he continues to play an active role in the country's politics. Only time will tell what the future holds for Cuba. Will it continue to struggle under the weight of its past, or will it be able to embrace change and move forward into the 21st century? If you want to learn more about the Cold War, I highly recommend checking out my video on the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War was the longest, most expensive, and most dangerous period in world history. It may not have been as deadly as World War II or as destructive as World War I, but the threat of mutually assured destruction kept the world up at night. In this series, we will explore some of the most important moments in the Cold War that could have easily turned hot. In this episode, we look at the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961 and 1962. We've all heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but few people know about the failed invasion that took place just 1 year earlier. 1961 was not a great year for the United States. The country was still recovering from the shock of the Soviets beating them into space with Sputnik. And President Eisenhower's legacy was being tarnished by charges that his administration had done little to stop the Soviets from placing missiles in Cuba. At the time, Cuba was a dictatorship ruled by Fidel Castro, who came to power in 1959 after leading a successful guerrilla war against the previous regime. Castro was seen as a threat to American interests because he had taken control of many businesses that were owned by Americans, and he had aligned himself with the USSR. On top of that, he was a thorn in the side of the CIA, who had made several attempts to assassinate him, all of which failed. In April 1961, the CIA trained Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. These men were fed a steady diet of propaganda and brainwashed into thinking they would be welcomed as liberators by the Cuban people. However, what the CIA didn't take into account is that the Cuban people were too keen on being told how to run their country by a bunch of foreigners, even if those foreigners were better looking. The mission started badly when 2 of the 3 main landing ships arrived late and without the troops. The remaining ship then came under attack by the Cuban Air Force and was forced to retreat. The next day, the 2 missing ships arrived, and the troops went ahead with the invasion. But the poorly planned operation was doomed from the start. The troops were low on supplies, ammunition, and food, and they were given no real plan of action. As a result, the invasion quickly descended into chaos. They were also not prepared for the staunch resistance put up by Castro's army. Within 72 hours, all of the invaders had either been killed, captured, or had fled. The Bay of Pigs fiasco made headlines around the world, and it was a massive embarrassment for the CIA and the United States. Less than a year later, however, an event would occur that would make the world forget about the Bay of Pigs. It was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war, and it was caused by something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in October 1962 over the placement of nuclear missiles by the Soviet Union in Cuba. The crisis was the result of a number of factors, including the increasing hostility between the 2 superpowers during the Cold War, the collapse of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the growing fear of nuclear war. As tensions grew between the 2 superpowers, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to place medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This was a risky move, as it brought the Soviet Union within striking distance of the United States. The missiles were capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and they could reach targets as far away as Washington, D.C. The United States was shocked when it discovered the missiles, and President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade on Cuba to prevent the Soviets from bringing in more missiles. The world held its breath as the standoff continued. Each day, it seemed as though the situation could explode into nuclear war. On October, a U-2 spy plane was sent over Cuba to gather intelligence on the missiles. The pilot of the plane was a man named Major Richard Hazer. He flew the plane so low that he had to manually trim the wings to keep the plane level. His pictures confirmed what the U.S. had feared: the Soviets were planning to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. He quickly developed the photos in his darkroom on board the plane and personally delivered them to the White House. Upon seeing the images, Kennedy gathered his closest advisors to discuss the situation. They had known that the Soviets were planning something, but they had no idea what it was. Now that they knew the truth, they had to come up with a plan to stop it. Their options were limited. They could do nothing and hope that the Soviets didn't launch the missiles. They could attempt to bomb the missiles before the Soviets could use them, or they could attempt to negotiate with the Soviets to remove the missiles. In the end, Kennedy decided to do all 3. He ordered the U.S. Air Force to develop a plan to bomb the missiles while at the same time reaching out to Khrushchev to see if they could come to an agreement. Now that the U.S. had proof that the Soviets were placing missiles in Cuba, Kennedy felt confident that he could stand up to Khrushchev. He wrote a firm letter telling him that the missiles had to be removed. But Kennedy also wanted to leave the door open for negotiation. He did want to give Khrushchev an ultimatum, because he knew that the Soviet leader was volatile and unpredictable. If he felt backed into a corner, he might just press the button. To avoid nuclear war, Kennedy had to tread carefully. Khrushchev responded to Kennedy's letter and said that the missiles would remain in Cuba. Kennedy then decided to take action. On October Air Force Major Richard Hazer flew back over Cuba to take more pictures of the missile sites. The Air Force had developed a secret process to make the film immediately visible. As Hayes flew over the island, he snapped picture after picture of the missile sites. When he returned to the U.S., the photos were developed and the world got its first good look at the Soviet missile bases. Kennedy showed these pictures to the American public and told them that the Soviets had to remove the missiles or there would be serious consequences. After the announcement, the world waited with bated breath for Khrushchev's response. On October, the Soviet leader finally blinked. He agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a written guarantee from Kennedy that the United States would not invade Cuba. In addition, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. The world had been brought to the edge of destruction, but cooler heads had prevailed. While the Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as one of the most dangerous moments in history, it's important to remember that it could have been much worse. The fact that both sides were able to back down and avoid nuclear war is a testament to the power of diplomacy. It was a close call, but in the end, reason won out over emotion. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major turning point in the Cold War. It led to a period between the United States and the Soviet Union, which saw a reduction in tensions and a decrease in the number of nuclear weapons stockpiled by each side. The crisis also led to the creation of a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, which allowed the two leaders to communicate directly with each other in the event of another crisis. In the years following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union continued to compete against each other in a variety of areas, including the space race and the arms race. But the two sides were able to keep their competition friendly and avoid another major crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately a success for both sides. The Soviet Union was able to successfully place missiles in Cuba, and the United States was able to successfully defend itself against them. Both sides were able to save face and avoid a major conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis has been the subject of numerous books, articles, and films. It remains one of the most studied events in modern history. The crisis is often seen as a defining moment of the Cold War, and many experts believe that it could have easily spiraled out of control and led to nuclear war. The fact that it didn't is a testament to the skill and restraint of the leaders involved. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a defining moment in the Cold War, and it had a profound impact on the world. It was a close call for humanity, but it was an important lesson in diplomacy and the dangers of nuclear war. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, cooler heads can prevail. 1991. Fall of USSR. Cuba in crisis on December. The government of the Soviet Union officially dissolved, bringing to an end the world's largest communist state and removing the last remaining communist superpower from the global stage. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the collapse of communism across Eastern Europe, it appeared that the era of ideological conflict between the United States and communism had finally come to an end. But while the Soviet Union was crumbling from within, there was a small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida preparing for its own moment in the spotlight. A country whose story would become a fascinating case study of how the end of the Cold War would play out differently for each nation involved. A place where American influence was strong but not total, Russian culture thrived, but economic opportunities were slim, and one man had ruled with an iron fist for more than 3 decades. Welcome to our channel, and today, let's find out what happened in Cuba when the Soviet Union fell. For decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in a struggle for global dominance, competing against each other in everything from weapons development to space exploration to sports competitions. The stakes were high and tensions were always high. But all the while, Fidel Castro's Cuba was quietly forging its own path, becoming the longest surviving communist state in the Western Hemisphere and the only one to successfully withstand an American invasion. It seemed as though nothing could threaten Castro's grip on power. And yet the Soviet Union's collapse would test his regime like never before. The year is 1991, and the Soviet Union is on the brink of collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms have failed to save the crumbling superpower from economic stagnation and growing nationalism. On December, the Soviet Union officially dissolves, marking the end of an era. As the news of the Soviet Union's collapse reaches Cuba, shockwaves are sent throughout the island nation. For decades, Cuba has relied heavily on its ties to the Soviet Union for economic and political support. And now many Cubans fear the worst for their own country. The United States tightens its grip on the embargo, hoping to bring about the downfall of the Cuban government. But Castro's regime proves surprisingly resilient. How did Cuba survive the fall of the Soviet Union? Let's find out. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, Cuba found itself in a precarious position. Its economy was tethered to the Soviets, who had subsidized it with cheap oil and provided it with essential goods and services. Now that lifeline was severed, the impact was immediate and devastating. By January, food shortages were widespread, and the Cuban government was forced to take drastic measures to ration essential supplies. People waited in long lines for basic necessities like rice, beans, and eggs, and many began to question the future of their country. But amidst the chaos, Castro's regime showed remarkable resilience. While some governments might have crumbled under such pressure, Castro's regime held firm, albeit with some concessions. It was a testament to their adaptability and tenacity, a stark reminder not to underestimate them. Castro addressed his people, urging them to stay the course and promising that they would overcome these challenges together. His words were a rallying cry for the nation, a call to arms against the seemingly insurmountable odds. In his speech, he spoke frankly about the crisis at hand, acknowledging the hardships that lay ahead and called for unity, hard work, and sacrifice. He appealed to the revolutionary spirit that had defined their struggles in the past, reminding them of their triumphs over seemingly impossible challenges. Castro urged Cubans to look inward, to find strength in their history and resilience, and to confront this new crisis with the same courage and determination. His words were powerful and resonated deeply with his audience. Castro painted a picture of a Cuba that would not be cowed by external pressures, a nation that would stand tall in the face of adversity and emerge even stronger than before. It was a message of hope in the darkest of times, a beacon guiding his people through the storm. And so the Cuban people rallied around their leader's words, drawing strength from their shared history and determination to forge a better future for themselves. They understood that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they were ready to face them head-on. The fall of the Soviet Union had dealt a severe blow to Cuba, leaving it teetering on the brink of economic collapse. The loss of Soviet subsidies and trade partners had plunged the country into chaos, with food shortages, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment running rampant. The Cuban government was desperate for a solution, but it was hard to see where they could turn. The U.S. embargo remained firmly in place, cutting them off from much-needed foreign aid and investment. And their traditional allies, the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations, had either fallen or were struggling to keep their heads above water. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a glimmer of opportunity emerged from an unexpected source. The European Union. The EU offered Cuba a chance at economic salvation, an enticing proposal that could pull the country back from the abyss. But there was a catch. To accept this offer, Cuba would need to make significant changes to its rigid communist system, opening up its economy to foreign investment and allowing for greater private enterprise. It was a risky move that could either lead them to prosperity or send them spiraling further into turmoil. But with their backs against the wall, the Cuban government had little choice but to take the gamble. They agreed to the EU's terms, setting in motion a series of reforms that would fundamentally alter the Cuban economy. The move was met with mixed reactions, both inside and outside Cuba. Critics argued that the reforms didn't go far enough and that the Cuban government was simply paying lip service to the idea of change. But despite the skepticism, the Cuban people were cautiously optimistic. The reforms offered them a glimpse of a brighter future, a chance to escape the economic quagmire that had become their everyday reality. Whether or not this gamble would pay off remained to be seen, but for now, the Cuban people were willing to hold on to hope as they navigated the uncertain waters of this new economic order. With the Soviet Union gone, Cuba found itself in uncharted territory. No longer content with the status quo, Cubans began to explore new possibilities and demand greater freedoms. The government responded with a mix of concessions and crackdowns, attempting to strike a delicate balance between stability and reform. As the years passed, Cuba began to transform itself, embracing limited forms of capitalism and diversifying its economy to survive. The country opened up to foreign investment, allowing multinational corporations to operate within its borders. This influx of capital helped to modernize and expand the Cuban economy, creating new jobs and boosting productivity. But it also led to concerns about foreign influence and the potential exploitation of Cuba's natural resources. Despite these concerns, the Cuban government continued to pursue economic reforms, introducing limited private property rights and allowing for the growth of small businesses. These measures were designed to stimulate entrepreneurship and provide Cubans with more economic opportunities. They also represented a significant departure from the country's communist roots and sparked fears of a growing divide between the rich and the poor. While the Cuban government was able to stabilize the economy and avoid total collapse, the country's political system remained unchanged. Castro's regime continued to maintain a tight grip on power, suppressing any dissent and preventing the emergence of a viable opposition. This lack of political reform has led to ongoing tensions with the United States, which has long called for democratic elections and human rights in Cuba. The Cuban government, however, has shown little willingness to compromise on these issues, citing the need to maintain stability and protect the country from foreign influence. In the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, Cuba found itself at a crossroads. The country's economy was in sharp decline. Its political system was increasingly isolated, and its people were yearning for change. However, despite these challenges, the Cuban government was able to navigate the turbulent waters of the post-Cold War era and secure the country's future, albeit in a vastly different form than before. While the reforms implemented in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse were initially designed to stabilize the economy and prevent total collapse, they ultimately led to a significant transformation of Cuban society. The introduction of limited capitalism and private enterprise created new opportunities for Cubans, but also contributed to a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Despite these challenges, the Cuban government's willingness to adapt and evolve has ensured the country's survival and Castro's regime's longevity. Only time will tell what the future holds for Cuba and whether the country will continue to embrace reform or return to its more isolated past. What are your thoughts on what happened in Cuba when the Soviet Union fell? Do you think Castro's regime would have fallen if not for the Soviet Union's collapse?